Hi, this is Eli Ocheltree of the SnoKing Beekeepers Association, and I'm starting off the meeting, SnoKing's monthly meeting, October 23rd, 2024. It was listed as a conference synopsis, but we've decided we are doing winterization, one quick review at the beginning, about 10 slides worth, for people who are still checklisting off what they're doing for winterization and are feeling like they just need to go through that checklist one more time. And then the second part of the presentation is on how for the last couple of 100 years and probably forever, beekeepers are still trying to figure out winterization and still debating the ups and the downs of wrapping, insulation, ventilation. What do you need to do? What do you not need to do? And I'm going to give you a lot to think about, and then we can talk about that, or we can talk about other things, the conference. Beginners, if you stay on toward the end or email me, if you don't feel like you are ready yet on winterizing, I or somebody else experienced on here, you could get a hold of us after the meeting. I stay until the last person falls asleep at the end, but we'll start with a quick overview of that and then go on to the presentation, the formal presentation, because I have to make it kind of interesting, talking about the last 200 years of winterization ideas. So we'll start with that review, the quick reminders, the overview. Okay, you've been treating for varroa and monitoring, right? And if you haven't gotten to it, something held you up, you're not finished, you're still OAVing, don't give up. You always put in that effort, even if you think it's getting kind of late to do it. Mouse guards. It hasn't frozen in my area yet, but make sure they're on before it freezes. And now would be a good time. Straps and cinder blocks work for raccoons, but not for bears. You need electric fence or an 8-foot type platform, 8 feet above the ground. Don't treat just enough, and don't fail to monitor and say, well, I treated enough. Follow up. And if you haven't checked your mite count in a month, don't be surprised. Go back in. This is an extended fall, and it's just starting to go below 40 at night. And that's sort of the trigger. It's not so much going below 50 for daytime highs. And Michael Duckett was the one who pointed this out to me years ago. Thank you so much, Michael, that it's 40. When the temperatures at night go below 40, and that keeps happening, the bees change their behaviors, whether they take liquid feed, whether they're raising brood. That seems to be the real trigger, is that below 40. Last year, it was really weird. I never figured out. It was really a spring dwindle, is what you call it. You've got a queen, but you don't have enough bees to really get started in the spring. And that's often called spring dwindle in February, March, and it happened a lot last year. I never heard a good explanation. I'm still open to a good explanation. I'm wondering if people just treated for varroa a little too late. The viruses damaged the larvae, they damaged the adults. The fat bees weren't really fat. Um, I'm guessing that that's what happened. Hope we don't see that again this year. But it was people all over Western Washington. It wasn't a few people. It wasn't just inexperienced. It was experienced as well. We're seeing this odd phenomenon. The queen is there. If you lose the queen, you understand why you lost the hive. But to have the bees just dwindle down and the queen is there and you don't see any signs of disease, just really low population. Let me know if you have an explanation or hear of one. You've got to have your insulation ventilation plan. I recommend that whatever it is, it's smooth. It's not disruptive. It's not quick changes. I really push that it's not moisture inside the hive that's the problem. It's the dripping on your bees. Any place that moisture can hit the cool surface above your bees and drip down. And I know not everybody agrees on that, which is part of the fun part of tonight's presentation. When I go into, people have been discussing this for 200 years. So if you're not in agreement with everyone around you, don't be surprised. We've been discussing it for hundreds of years, if not millennia. And urge, I know the people on here who are either beginners or they're mentoring beginners, don't forget to kind of go through the checklist. First of all, we are going to remember the KISS principle. Keep it simple, students. Okay, this is the pep talk. Keep your bees dry housed, fed, treated for the varroa, and do no harm. Unless you are ready to risk your bees, you're experienced, and you want to try something, and in which case, if you're experienced, you only try it with a hive or two because you're experienced and you know this can backfire. But don't do anything too radical or experimental at the last minute until you feel that you can risk those bees. And how much did a nuke cost last year if you need to replace your bees? Yeah. Then you are going for a deep's worth of bees at the bottom of your hive stack, a deep's worth of stores at the top. You're getting rid of any extra empty space. You want that packed. You feed the liquid as long as you can. A lot of people that's already happened. Dry is for emergency, but bees take it pretty well. It's amazing, especially if you get it under the inner cover. Above the inner cover, they sometimes wait until even February, late January, February, when the coldest part of the winter has ended, which often comes in December, beginning of January. This is an extended fall. We haven't really, I have not had a freeze yet. That's amazing. We're almost to November. If you still treat for the varroa, if you didn't do enough, you know you didn't do enough, don't give up. It might still work. It's late. It would have been better earlier, but hey, we do what we can. I'm for insulated tops year round, even if you don't agree on the wrapping around the sides. If you have a solid bottom board, great. If you only have a slide out under your screen, slide it in. That essentially is a solid bottom board if it's all the way in. Then they still do a little bit of brood rearing. That's okay. A little bit of late bees, hopefully fat bees. They aren't going to wear themselves out. They're going to stop progressing for a while. But our bees do brood rear until freezing. We do see them flying, bringing in pollen. There's not really a nectar flow out there that I know of. And if you're still saying, do I have enough stores? It's just that deep's worth. And if that's overkill, some people will tell you that's more than you need. 10 frames of deep, that's mostly honey and pollen. However, it's a cheap way to take care of your bees, and you never know what the winter's going to be like. Actually, in our winters, if you compare us to like Canada, you say, well, they don't need a whole deep's worth of stores. Well, actually, bees do better in a cold winter, which is part of the later presentation. The arguments about, hey, but my bees, when they cluster tightly and I let them get nice and cold and settle in and don't give them any ideas by warming them up in any way, they eat less food, they do better. Yes, that absolutely can be true. I think everybody agrees on it. We just don't know which winter we're going to have. Feeding that white sugar is plant sugar. It's great for your bees. Liquid was better. You're probably switching to dry by now. And banked honey is the best spring feed. But if you offer your bees sugar, those little hoarders will often wait to use that honey until they really need it in the spring. And you can't tell how much your bees need. Hive to hive, it varies. If you change the queen during the summer, the amount that colony, you think of it as the same bee colony, but it isn't because the queen changed. All right, so we're all going to say it depends until you go crazy, beginners, and then you'll start saying it depends. And I have no winter forecast for you. You could just use the cute little caterpillars and decide by how wide the brown band is. That's as good as I've got. I don't know what's going to happen. The weather worm works well too. You know, the little thing that kids make as a craft, and you stick it on your windowsill outside. And if it's wet, you know it's raining. If it's white, you know it's snowing. If it's hard and stiff, it's freezing outside. Okay. And if it's blown off the windowsill, it's windy. So I have no other weather forecast. You do need to, as a beekeeper, be aware of the temperatures. Don't be surprised to see your bees make quick trips out for cleansing flights. And actually, these late sunny day sun breaks where they all rush out, don't worry, they're not swarming, okay? Relax. They couldn't if they wanted to. There's no place or way they can abscond if they wanted to. It would have to get really warm for that. So that's not it. They're rushing out because the poor little things need to poop, and they're in distress. Okay, just have pity on them. But they are gradually moving into this cluster formation. They're spending more time closer together every night. And we are below 57. It mentions 57. They have to start heat retention, start warming the queen and warming any brood that's still there. They've got to keep doing that. And then tighter and tighter and tighter, that cluster will come together, especially as the brood rearing stops and as the temperatures stay down. And they can do it very, very efficiently. In tighter cluster, more of them in a smaller area, they have less surface area. That they can lose the heat through. So when we're looking at these slides about what people have been saying for 200 years, well, if you encourage them to move around, then now they're all spread out and they can lose the heat more easily. If you have a large hive, it's going to need more, and a large number of bees is going to need more food. Well, yes, it's a balance. And these kinds of considerations and concepts, when you're a beginner, you just got to go through the checklist and say, I did this, this, and this, and I did everything that was recommended, and relax. Losing your bees wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. You get to harvest all the honey if you want it. If you do have a dead out, that is the consolation prize. If you should have a dead out, remember, you get the honey. Or you can save it for your bees next spring. Winterization. I recommend you kind of think of it in stages, and you've already done this, right? You got the number of boxes down. You've got a telescoping lid on or a peaked roof, not a flat, leaky migratory. You've got top insulation on. If you still have liquid feeder, you're probably changing out right about now, though. If you haven't already changed out, it's under the insulation, and that's the only way you could be feeding where I am right now, is if your liquid feed is being kept warm from the heat that's rising from the hive. And as you're getting rid of that empty space up there and taking the liquid feed out, dropping it down, because they're not going to be taking the liquid feed for very long. The temperatures are just going too low if you aren't already past that point. Straps and weighted lids if you need them. Raccoons, wind, anything. Robbing screens or mouse guards, something metal to stop those critters from getting in. And that's part of the reason people leave the robbing screen on. The only problem is the robbing screens catch dead bees behind them. So make sure you remove the robbing screen or lift it up enough to pull any dead bees that might block the entrance later. Okay, so you've probably done all that. Maybe you've already raised the back of the hive. Especially if you have a solid bottom board, that lets any condensation or moisture that forms roll toward the front of the hive and out the front entrance. If you are using a screen bottom board, you've got to get that mite count board all the way in. I think there are a few people who disagree, but overwhelmingly people say, let's not have that draft at the bottom of the hive. You're taking that liquid feed out. If you're going to put dry feed on, if you put it directly on the frames, your bees will be able to access it earlier than if you lift it up and put it on a surface, like the inner cover or the bottom of a Vivaldi board, it's called, or a candy board. If the bees can't directly access it from the top of the frames, if they have to go through a hole in the inner cover to get to it. If it gets really cold, they got to stay in cluster. That can be fine if they've got plenty of honey down below. If you're going to try a moisture or quilt box, I don't think they hurt, even if you don't need one. I think they work fine. They give you a little more insulation up there too. So you've switched to dry feed and pollen sub now, or you are doing it right now. I recommend, I don't use any top vent, but if you're going to use one, a small one. And under your moisture control so that you're not losing any more heat than you need to. And my last step, which I don't get to until it freezes, is if I'm going to wrap, that's when I wrap. I want my bees to know that it's winter. I want them to have that sense of the temperatures have changed. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. So I keep showing these diagrams again and again and again, thinking about what you want. On the right-hand side, we want to start out the winter with the bees brood to the bottom. We put so much honey on top of them, and it's now getting too cold to go into your hives. So don't worry excessively about this because bees do what they're going to do anyway. But hopefully you got the brood down, and you fed them enough feed, or you left enough feed on there that they've got a lot of honey. A little to the sides of the cluster is good down here, like frames 1 and 10 on the bottom box and above. And then above that, if you've got winter feed of any kind, then your moisture absorbency, insulation, telescope, the inner cover is often where people are they're putting it right above the feed, or the feed is on it. So you do need a ceiling in there of some kind, something that helps trap heat right above the frames. But you don't need 2 or 3. You don't need an inner cover and then a Vivaldi board or something with another surface. One should be enough. And then your whole goal over on the left is you don't want the drips coming down. You don't want your outer cover to be cold enough and have warm, moist air rising from the hive to hit it and drip down. And that's why you've got your inner cover or your Vivaldi board, winter feeder, whatever has a surface here with a hole with the air can rise, some air can rise into the wood chips, the moisture absorbency, insulation, and that all of that is going to keep any condensation that forms underneath your outer cover, no matter what, it can't drip down directly onto your bees. You've got this installation, you've got those wood chips or whatever absorbencies there, and you've got an inner cover. So this scenario here, there isn't going to be cold condensing water dripping down on your bees. It's the concept, however you work this out. And the cluster and how it forms and how tightly it forms and what it means in terms of how your bees are eating food or moving around or raising brood, that's more difficult. That depends a lot on your individual hive, the number of bees in the hive, the insulation of the hive, the winds that are hitting the hive, all the little microclimate things that make your hives different from somebody else's, and even the hive on one side of your house from the hive on the other side of your house. And it makes a huge difference. This metabolic rate here, think of that as how much the bees have to eat in carbs, honey stores especially, and some pollen, but especially the honey stores. Look how it's high, yes, if you're at negative 20 degrees Celsius, oh my goodness, that's cold. But if you're at say 10 Celsius, and I had to put down here that's about 50 degrees, your bees, when they're not super cold, and that 45 is to 50 range, ambient temperature outside, which happens during the days, maybe not at nights, but that is their optimal rate, according to the research people, that's actually when they use the least feed. This is where you balance. Do you think your bees need insulation? Do you think they need rain protection? Do you think they need to be moved to the lee side of your house rather than the windy side of your house? This is where you have to make the decisions and you learn to say, it depends. I wish I could be more helpful, but that's just part of it. And I hope no one's confused anymore about a shim, a spacer, a candy board, a quilt board, a Vivaldi board. They're things that just give you a little space there. And they make the space for the pollen patty or the newspaper with the dry sugar right on top of your brood frames, like this little tiny shim here, which is called an emery or a honey shim sometimes. It's actually used for letting bees have an extra entrance when they're making a lot of honey up top in the hive. And then insulation is insulation. And this is sometimes called a candy feeder, candy board, Vivaldi board. And if you put this in, you don't need the inner cover. It is basically an inner cover. And there's a jar feeder there, but during the winter, you're not going to have that in. You're going to open that hole up and let a little bit of air escape through. Okay, I zipped through that. I hope you are feeling good about the checklist. If not, you got some experienced people here you can get a hold of. You could put notes in the chat. I'm going to go on with what I consider the fun part. I feel like I have to offer something more fun than always talking about winterization and varroa. Aren't those the two things you get tired of talking about? Swarms is more interesting. Splits is more interesting, but varroa and winterization are just work, right? Okay, but this is going to be fun because I went to this Project Gutenberg, which is one of those digital repositories of old books and manuscripts, copyright free. Really fun. And if you can't afford to fill your bookcase, and who can, with every possible book that was ever written out there, this is fun. And you can get back to like the 1800s. And people have scanned in old copies of books. So I did kind of a literature review and just looked. I'm fascinated by beekeeping history, partly because I keep seeing we keep doing the same things. And some of the solutions are kind of the same. And there's one big difference that I want to point out because I am a farm girl in a way. I grew up on a farm where you didn't solve everything by using up electricity and fossil fuel, and you did more sustainable self-sufficiency type, low cost, and better for the environment solutions on a small family farm. But before I get to that, I really enjoyed doing this, looking for what people did the last 200 years for the winterization issues and concerns. And I didn't find any new ideas, but a lot of ideas we've been reworking. We've updated them a little. The spectrum is what really interests me. Even in what's printed, even back then, beekeepers just don't, we just aren't in a narrow group, demographics wise or background wise. I don't even think personalities are necessarily all the same. We don't have the same worldview. And that leads to we have different beekeeping philosophies. And I put up quickly, here's some of the books that you can get. Let's see, what was the oldest one? There was an 1851, I think. Yeah, here's 1853, Quinby. Some was even older than that. And the older ones will quote the classics. They'll quote Greek and Latin authors that I couldn't read, but back in the 1800s, people could study the classics and could read the Latin and the Greek treatises on bees. And there were some, amazingly. So, okay, I went back into the 1800s. So literally, this goes back getting closer to 200 years. Now, when I say that there's a spectrum and beekeepers aren't all the same place on the spectrum, I really mean we go all the way from micromanaging, even beekeepers that have been beekeeping for a long time, and brand new beekeepers, sometimes they really want to, they just convinced that if they could do enough, they're going to be a success at beekeeping. They're going to get the higher honey production, and they may be right. Then there's the complete opposite of the spectrum where it's, let it be. If the bees are better off if you don't mess with them. And this leads to a complete spectrum between the to wrap or not to wrap. To feed, how much extra feed should you give them? Plain sugar, purified sugar, or not to feed. Do you want to shelter them? Are you into rain, wind shelters or none? Would you bring your bees indoor in some ways if you could, or outdoor? And this goes over the last couple 100 years from putting bees in lofts, which I still hear that occasionally people do have bees still up in a stable or a barn loft. In an attic of houses, this is real. People did this when people didn't heat their houses as much as they do now. Houses were drafty. I grew up in a draftier, older farmhouse. We heated mostly with wood. And people put them in the attics of their buildings because you didn't heat the attic, but it's very safe. And there's a little residual heat that could give the bees an edge. Some people do completely open-sided rain snow shelters. A lot of people do a three-sided, have in the last 200 years done a three-sided, and maybe the prevailing wind is deflected by one side, then the other two sides also help, but maybe it faces the best sunbreak part of the sky. For me, that's the south in the winter. So facing especially south. People have actually built whole houses, bee houses. The AZ hives that you're hearing about that are so popular, they did a lot of those, and people have never totally quit. I know we have one person, I don't know if Myung's on here, but he's put pictures of his bee houses. But his bee house is like a three-sided with ventilation top and bottom. So it's more like three-sided, but it looks like a bee house with the entrances on the one side and the fronts of the hive is very protected. Cellars. Bees were put a lot in cellars. And that was, depending on how you did it, it could have excellent climate control. Now, in these winterizing solutions, when I was thinking about it, we have really changed in how we raise bees. Bees used to be a part of a farm. Everybody had bees. Even if you had a large vegetable garden, people tended to have bees. And especially with World War II, there was a big push because they needed beeswax, especially for the war effort. And after World War II, people kept keeping bees. They'd gotten into it, but the government had promoted and pushed it. And then there was a drop, as I think partly both parents are working outside the home, people are in more urbanized areas. But growing up on a 40-acre farm myself, and I am somewhat older, so I can do a little living history here and tell you that in a small farm household, your farm is intended to be more sustainable and self-sufficient. You're not going to run out to the grocery store. We shopped for groceries. My dad took the list uh, once a month. That was pretty much it for groceries. You didn't waste gas, time, energy. Your meals were planned more in advance. You had a rather large pantry. You had the shelves full of canning goods that you already canned. Um, and there was less waste this way too. I mean, your fresh vegetables don't have a lot of packaging to them. Less reliance on plastics and disposables, which turn into landfill material. You could go off the grid and do okay, and a lot of what you did was off the grid. You didn't intend for your greenhouse to be electric dependent on fans and heating. You worked for passive heating, passive cooling approaches. It was built in. A small farm was a system that supports and reinforces itself. Okay, but when we beekeep now, or do any kind of farming that's specialized, we've compartmentalized. We no longer have any feedback and buffers and loops. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute, just the way I grew up. And that's not even a full farm, really. It was a very small, good place to raise a half dozen kids. Tenino, down by Tenino, Washington, which is on the road to take the Aberdeen Tenino exit off I-5. Now everything is electrical based. If you think about it, your tools and everything. My dad still did hand drills and such, and we didn't. Everything wasn't electrified. The sheds weren't all electrified, the barns and such. Which everything consumes so much fossil fuel today. I don't want to make political statements, but boy, we are producing hazardous and landfill waste on an ordinary farm. It's been when we do just beekeeping by ourselves, we've compartmentalized it. We've taken it like many other farming things and turned it into something that's probably going to be somewhat environmentally polluting. Or even if we're very careful, it's still not sustainable and self-sufficient. For example, because I need a really good example. I think I've lost people already here. This sounds political and abstract. When you are on an ordinary family farm for centuries, you had chickens. Well, yeah, chickens get eggs and you can have a chicken in the pot for Sunday dinner, right? You just catch those roosters that have been waking you up every morning. Okay. But the chickens also eat insect pests. And they're always in the garden, and if you don't want them in that part of the garden, laying chicken wire over is one way to keep them from scratching up what you just did. But they're free ranging somewhat. And there's a guinea fowl. If you have really small ticks and fleas, that's why guinea fowl were used in so much of the country, because they eat really tiny, apparently, things. Just think of, okay, I'm already pointing out you don't need as many insecticides. You don't need as many tick and flea insecticides. The barn cats, everybody had barn cats. You didn't put out rat poison. You made sure that you fed the barn cat mama so that she had a few more kittens that year. They ate rodents, moles, and they get the baby rabbits every year. They keep the rabbit population down if your coyotes and whatever else weren't helping out. Dogs. Dogs would chase off the smaller predators. I don't know if they ever really caught any of those rabbits, but chasing off raccoons and possums and bobcats, everybody had an outdoor dog and providing an alarm system for a larger predator or a threat. You didn't go out and buy fertilizer. That if fertilizing factories, ones that produce it, I'm sure they are pollutants. No, it's produced there on the farm. What do you think that is? It comes out of that end of the cow. And you spread it out in the fields, and it helps grow the vegetation, maybe the corn that you're going to chop up and green chop or silage, or you store the corn cobs or whatever you're going to feed back to the livestock, even not just in the summer, but through the winter. Beehives were part of this. They increased the pollination rate. And if you're getting bumper crops of everything on your apple trees and your berries and your vegetables, you can afford a little crop loss due to pests. And you don't run around frantically spraying more chemicals. So specialized compartmentalized farming generates landfill waste and hazardous waste, and it worked on a farm. I never hear anybody actually talk about this. The system worked. This was much more self-sufficient and sustainable. Maybe you still had, like my dad was still a paycheck job person. He still went out and worked a paycheck job when I was growing up. But it was incredible. This was something that I could see how the cycle worked. Now we're trying to keep bees in urban situations, and people are saying they notice right away the pollination rate on their gardens. Maybe you don't have to worry as much about insects if you're getting twice the amount of produce, twice the amount of production. And so maybe just that little bit's helping. And the beehives are benefiting. The bees are benefiting from whatever's planted out there in urban areas. So it's a small thing, but farming was meant to be this self-sufficiency, sustainable, and we changed it for better, for worse. And getting back to it kind of makes me feel good as a beekeeper. In that old style, sustainable, self-sufficient farm type mold, because you weren't using all kinds of pesticides and insecticides, and because your bees were safer from all the different things that could get to them in the city. Rats, raccoons. You didn't have to put up poisons for that because they were getting less industrial pesticides that they were not in close proximity to. All of this worked better. Okay, I'm kind of on the stump. I know I'm on the soapbox here. I'll get to the interesting part. But to me, this is interesting. They and you had choices of where you put your bees. Instead of having a 6 houses to the acre lot and you don't have a lot of choices where you put your bees. You had choices. You could put them on the south side of the hill. You could move them from the windy to the lee side without interfering with anybody's jogging path or kitty's wading pool in the next yard. It You had a lot more options for the housing and the way you moved them. And housing. I'll go into that. That's really one of the most interesting things in the last 200 years in winterization. And on the old style farm, you had all this protection. I mean, the raccoons and the possums and stuff, skunks, they wouldn't be messing with, well, you'd know if a skunk had been around. Our dog got skunked a few times, but they weren't bothering the chickens and we only had bees for a short period of time, but they weren't bothering the rest of the livestock. Now, increased microclimate and housing options. That's one of the big things that they had, and people are bringing that back. I find people are looking at their housing options. They're talking alternative hives, but it's also where you put the hive. People put them up in lofts. They actually put them in the attics of buildings because the attics were slightly different in those days. A lot of people are doing the rain shelters and say it's working, partly because the beekeeper likes not getting rain pouring down their neck while they're bending over the hive and they have to get in there. They have to change out those jars. They have to do something that just has to be done. It's time critical. Just a quick check. So those rain shelters are nice for the beekeeper as well as the bees. Three-sided ones solve a lot of wind problems, especially in urban areas where you don't have a lot of choice about where you're placing your bees. Sheds. You in the farm, you could take a shed and you could use any shed to put your bees in. You could pick the best location. And I'm going to point out that you didn't use a shed for just one thing. People think of a bee shed and a chicken house as two separate things. Why? You don't have to have them separate. My cats have kittens in the chicken shed, and if I put bees in there, everybody get along just fine. Uh, everything works out. The rats aren't killing the chickens, and the cats have a place to have the kittens, and the bees can benefit too. I'll show you some examples of that. And cellars, people use cellars a lot. Root cellars were what people used for long-term storage, and they're a little tricky in a high water table area like much of Western Washington, but they're still doable. Cellars hold the temperature of the ground, and around here, a lot of the ground does not freeze, partly due to the high water table, partly because we are a maritime region. We have a lot of thermal stability with all of these bodies of water and water in our soil. In the plains areas, they were trying to avoid the fact that everything above ground was definitely going to freeze, and probably the first half foot of the ground as well, and up into Canada. So they were serious about when they made bee cellars. Today, people are returning that in warehousing, using old apple warehouses, and they use them for a lot of purposes, not just overwintering, but actually swarm control, um, increasing the longevity of queens that have been raised, but not yet shipped out to their final hive destination. This is a lot of different options that people don't even think about having. So on the left here, that is a hive that was kept apparently for years in the Grand Rapids High School. Yes, Grand Rapids, like Michigan. Um, I think I think that's where Grand Rapids is. They just said Grand Rapids, way up north, I'm sure. And they kept bees in the attic. Why not? In a high school. We wouldn't even think of that today. But then our attics are somewhat different. Next to it are two hives that were up in a stable loft. And they're out of the way. They're protected from pests. I mean, especially if you got the barn cats and such. Uh, could you pick a better place? protected from the extremes of weather. Bee cellars. Now, this is not considered one of the best bee cellar designs, but it's halfway sunk in. It is one type of bee cellar. And I would guess this is the plains because it's in a flat area. It's built the same way a sod house was cut into the ground. Here's the hillside one. I'm more used to seeing this kind. It keeps you up out of the water table. Often cut into the side of a hill and then more dirt rounded around it. This is very sustainable because you're using materials that are already on the farm. Here's another one. This one's rather elaborate. If you're putting hundreds of hives in, having a floor plan, ventilation plan, and often they heat. These were often heated in the Great Plains, really cold areas to keep. Remember, I showed you that graph and I was talking about the 45 to 50 degrees ambient temperature around the hive is actually optimal for the lowest consumption of energy stores for at least a certain size hive, a standard overwintering size hive in cluster, and keeping the bees dark and undisturbed. People found that this worked in cellars. Some people made it work, some people didn't follow all the rules. But here's a floor plan, and this floor plan gives you which rooms, and I don't think all the rooms were used for workshop. Some were, some weren't. Does this have the heat in it? Has stairs coming down. Cold air sinks. So during the winter, that's when you would come down into a cellar. Logically, that'd be the best for trapping cold and letting heat rise out. And bees do generate a lot of heat, so that's a consideration. I might jump around a little bit. Uh, Here's basic upper insulation using chaff, which seems to be pretty much like wood shavings. Here's an actual complete bee house. Apparently in America, they had been making these for some time. I don't know how many are in use in the northern states. I know people are really interested in bringing them back, maybe the AZ hives. Here's one for 10 colonies. And this is the interior of it, I think. And here's the hives, standard hives. So they didn't do any special equipment like for an AZ hive, and facing out. Kind of attractive for working on if you want to do a quick check. Combining chickens and bees, just like chickens and cats, and actually a lot of barns they would combine. They just put the chickens in with the horses or the cows or anything else, and everybody benefits from the heat generated. And the chickens keep down the bugs and the pests. If the cats are wandering in and out, they're keeping down the rodents. And this was a standard thing. A lot of people don't know how to design a chicken house. Chickens actually need a fair amount of ventilation. They are susceptible to respiratory illnesses. I sold chickens for a while and raised them for a while. A lot of people think that the tighter you make something, the better it is. No, that can breed disease and stress animals, especially like chickens. They can't be in an airtight environment. I remember explaining that to my wonderful husband who built this airtight chicken house, and I said, you can't do that. You have to have ventilation. You have to at least have not draft on the chickens, but you have to let some of that moisture out, which is a little different than bees because bees can vent their own. They can do their own HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. Here's the inside. And there's some chicken wire here. They decided you don't want your chickens actually roosting on top of the beehives because chickens is it 30% of leave 30% of the droppings where they roost. So if they decide to roost on your hives, yeah. But there's tricks to designing a chicken house so that bees would not do that. Chickens like to roost on the highest thing available. Make something higher than the hives, you wouldn't have a problem. This is a prison farm apiary. Hey, you can have more bees out away from the public, and you have a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands. And so apiaries in the correction system have been part of history. Oh, I had to put this in just because it was so funny. You notice all the bee veils, but the one that I think is funny is I think that lady with the fancy hat, I think she put a bee veil over the fancy hat. Oh, that's pretty nice. She wasn't going to show up for that picture without her hat on and properly dressed. So yeah, the other lady looks like an entire shawl. I just had to put that in. Sorry, comic relief. Oh, and the idea that when we buy a hive, we have to go prepared to dive into it. When you bought hives in the old days, if they were straw skips or another type of hive, they used to call it a box hive, but it wasn't, it was a hive where the lid was a flat piece of wood. And then there was a rectangular box, often fairly long, that came down, like even 20, 24 inches high. And the bees would attach their comb to the lid. And if you tilted it, you could see the bottom of the hive, like you're seeing this. It wasn't fastened to the bottom board. You would carefully tilt this and you'd be able to see how good quality the hive was. When you buy a nuke in a skep in the old days, you buy a starter because it's a start. It started. It's basically our equivalent of a nuke. You could actually tip and look inside. And the same for if you were buying one of these, they had no fixed frames. The combs were just coming down from that piece of wood. And if you tilted and you carefully cut anything that was attached to the edges, you could actually lift all the combs out together very carefully, and you could examine the combs that way. Not couldn't do much with them because they're all attached to the same piece of wood. I got to find a picture of that. It's an interesting type of way to keep bees, but also you could check because you could tilt the entire hive over. These it was like Land's type combs that they came way down, at least double the depth of a what we consider a deep frame today. So I just thought it was interesting to that that's something that I hadn't thought of until I was really watching and reading these old books, which you can get too through the Project Gutenberg and a couple of other internet archive projects. And if you need a specific one, I have downloaded quite a bit, and Adobe Acrobat form was the best form that I could find that I could download a lot of it in. Unprotected hives, worth looking at. Here's unprotected hives. And there's a 2 deep on that side, 3 deep over there. Um, that is, people have done that. I think these do have metal. Yeah, I think these do have metal tops on them at least. Here's a picture of under the snow. We don't have insulating snow. Sometimes when we're talking about wrapping, people say, why would you wrap? You don't even get snow. Well, that's true. I wish we did get snow sometimes because then I would just feel like the bees had gone to bed and they're all insulated in and nobody's going to get any crazy ideas about brooding up too early, I hope, because hopefully they realize they're covered by snow and it's winter. Um, Unprotected, here's an unprotected hive, but it created its own air pocket, the heat from it. So, and snow is porous. Air does move through it. So the bees are fine. Actually, as long as the entrances are not completely blocked with dead bees, for example. And then they were checking it. They went ahead and opened up this hive and it was doing fine. But it had the snow protecting it. It was really interesting. Winter clusters were studied a lot, and actually back some time ago. This is a somewhat older, very detailed diagram of where the bees are and aren't, and where the stores are and aren't. We're still using this information that was gathered and diagrammed out. We're still using it years later. I don't know if anyone's really repeating this because it was so well done. And people talk about reversing the boxes. This is actually saying you're more likely to be manipulating. You're more likely to be moving the frames around. Hey, especially me. I'm not lifting those big heavy deeps. I'm more likely to lift the top deep off to the side carefully, because I don't know where the queen is, very carefully, and then manipulating by moving the brood, the sealed brood, the unsealed brood, moving it down, brood to the bottom again, and then room to grow. A lot of those empty frames in late spring, well, late winter, early spring maybe, that are now empty, moving them back up. If I feel it would help stimulate the hive to realize that it does have room to work. So not actually reversing the boxes, moving the frames. Here's wrap and okay, I was saying that you don't waste, you don't use all this consumable, disposable. When you have something, you reuse it. And on a farm, it's just perfectly natural. You save your twine, but you tie your baling twine together. I wouldn't be surprised if it's baling twine. And you old blankets, old carpeting. You don't just throw things into the landfill. Everything gets reused. And so they did a lot of creative wrapping in those days. This one is showing you that you could put the metal telescoping lid underneath or on top. Uh, it said tar paper packing. That doesn't look like just tar paper. If that's tar paper, it looks to me like they've put some kind of insulation inside of it. I would have guessed wool blankets or carpeting myself. Insulating snow. It really is a way of insulating your hives. When you are reading these older books, there was just this incredible explosion of innovation, and it kind of came in two parts. We talk about the Industrial Revolution in America as there was one industrial revolution, and it really hit after the Civil War and things ramp up. Okay. It's happening before the Civil War. They're starting to mechanize everything. The steam engines and everything are coming in. Yeah. So it's really before the Civil War, and then it keeps going. In Britain and other parts of the world, they think of it as happening in like two different revolutions. And by 1851, remember that's the Langstroth publishes his one of his first versions. I think it's when he actually gets his patent and publishes his ideas on movable frames. So he can get the credit for all that. But there was this big exhibition in London called the Crystal Palace Exhibition, and beekeeping was highlighted there. And everybody was into beekeeping. Everybody had an idea on how to make the perfect hive. People put observation hives in their living rooms, even people that weren't really beekeepers. It was so fascinating. And everybody thought they could come up with the best. And they made them some of them were very ornate, looking like little houses. Look at the cute little shutters and the cute little porticos and porches. And then there were these stands and ways to display the honey and ways to collect the honey. And they just really went crazy with incredible innovation. So that 1851 is already piquing the interest in beekeeping, and it never totally goes away until we get so urbanized that we sort of drop off. I think a decade or two after World War II in this country is where we kind of drop off, and we've got other concerns, other things on our mind. There were a lot of interesting ideas. I talked about sustainability, self-sufficiency. Okay, you need to shade your hives, and microclimates are available on your farm. If you have any size land, you decide where you're going to put your bees and you believe they're getting the best protection from wind, maybe by trees, from sun, maybe by your orchards. In this case, grapevines. This is called the grapevine apiary in the book. And in one of these old books, Manual of the Apiary, and there is a grapevine in front of each hive on the south side, and the grapes are going to leaf out at the time of the year that you most need protection from the hot sun in this area. Reusing, rethinking, instead of going out and buying something plastic and putting it up, or even brand new lumber. No, just use what you already have. Use the plan. Build it into the plan. The actual packing and such, the telescoping cover came in pretty soon. I think the heat trapping and the rain deflection, snow deflection, that brought it about in the northern areas very fast. And the wood shavings. Here's some examples of it. Slightly slanted roof, which is actually, when they say telescoping cover, it has sides. I've got a picture later on. This isn't like a couple inches overlapping like ours. This overlaps. It's like an extra wall. So it's also extra insulation. And putting underneath that the tray of, we would call it moisture absorbency and insulation, planer shavings. If you don't know what a planer is, it's a tool that takes shavings off while you're smoothing off or shaping wood. You'd probably be more used to seeing shavings come off a mechanical power-driven lathe, but it was a hand tool that did that. So wood shavings. Um, I've got this right. Sorry, I can skip this one. I've got this right side up later. Putting hives together. We do this. They were doing it in those days. This is the exterior of a plan to put 4 hives together. Labor was so cheap. People considered their labor or whoever they were paying, they paid them so little, but materials were expensive. It was worth pushing 4 hives together, or 6. I think I've got an example coming up. 6 hives together and putting a wood case over them that you assembled every winter and disassembled in the spring. Here's the outside and here's the inside, and putting them in. Also, you had to be self-sufficient and sustainable, because where are you going to get more bees from? You could get them shipped, but I don't think they had great overnight shipping in those days, unless you had somebody at one end of the railway line or something that could put them on for you and you pick them up at the other end. But they had all these systems. Here's the telescoping cover. This shows you much better. It's this whole piece here slides over. So when they're using paper and lightweight wood, and then here's a bag, a chaff, they call it chaff cushion. So the wood shavings in a bag basically placed on top. Probably I would suspect a feed bag, really. But the paper was heavier weight too, but especially if it's got layer upon layer on top. Here's another one. The people used whatever was at hand. They didn't go out and buy something brand new and plasticky. And this was an interesting diagram of how people were planning to put the hives together in groups. And when they put them into these sheds together, they'd call these tenement hives sometimes. Tenement meaning like apartment or condo. So they're going to shove them all in together. This person did not want to break that rule of moving more than 2 feet at a time or whatever. So, yes, they had their hives spread out, summer position. Then later in the summer, they start moving some of them closer together and trying not to cause excessive drift between the hives. And so they do it in stages. And so there's stage 1 of the shift, stage 2, and then they're ready to put the shed around them, the winter cases. Here's more of the wrapping, and then making sure that the edges of the paper are held down. Looks like they're using lathe, a very thin wood that you could nail into quickly. And maybe including some straw and such. Here's another root cellar where you go down the stairs into it. But an above ground, making it easier on the person to start above ground. Double walled hives. Those came up and they didn't get as popular as you would think. And I think part of the problem is it's really easy for insects and wax moth and I don't know what else to hide in there. Rodents, maybe. I think maybe it was too easy, was part of it. This is apparently the smaller box that's going to go, I think, inside of this larger box. And then here's the tray that's going to sit on top, underneath this telescoping, as they call it, hive cover. It looks like a whole other box. Here's a picture of how this is what they did. They moved the entire telescoping cap, dropped it over the hive, which is essentially double walling and insulating. This is one of the weirdest things, the burying hives. They don't have a root cellar. I don't know how successful this really was, but it was done. Burying the hives because soil, if you get below the frost depth, then your hives wouldn't freeze, right? If they're still at 40 degrees or 45. And of course, going for that magic like 45. If you could get down in our climate, that would be interesting too, because we do have soil temperatures that are pretty much not freezing in a lot of the area. And you could hold your bees at a stable temperature, even on sunny days and such. If you could stabilize the temperature, you could cut food consumption and you might improve viability of your hives. Here's long trenches. All of these hives that you see in this picture in the foreground came out of those trenches. They buried them and brought them back out in the spring. Another three-sided shelter. This one thing they did was they deliberately intended to pack it with all the straw or anything they could. It says stone on there. I think they mean that they're weighting them down with stones, I think is what it means. And then putting as much straw on top to the sides. I'm sure that this is backed up the solid side to the prevailing winds, and then a slanted roof to help drainage of melting snow and rain. Hives are off the ground so that rodents can't easily get into them. If you want to discourage rodents getting into anything, like a nice, delicious, warm, beautiful nesting material place to raise a whole bunch of babies, if you want to keep your rodents out, you raise, and this is why chicken houses too were raised up a good foot or more above the ground. And then when your barn cats are out prowling, they can catch the rats before they can get up and chew their way in. The four hives inside, this is the apiary, the tenement hives as they call them. And they would leave them there outdoor and actually leave them in. And I enjoyed doing this. I thought this was interesting. They said until the clover bloom. And I leave my wrapping on. I put it on late if I'm going to put it on hives, and I leave it on for spring buildup to encourage the spring buildup, especially with the last 3 springs that we've had that are really cold. I hope everybody's getting good ideas about what they like and don't like and would never do. Now, I would not be insulating with leaves. That would just have so many bugs and everything in it. But hey, depends on how cold it gets. Here again are those they put the hives inside and then insulated around them. In this case with dry leaves. Did that. With all of this moving hives around, these people who were smaller must have been incredibly strong. They're great shape because you work so much outside and physically, but carrying these hives, they got kind of heavy. And a lot of these were the thicker wood than what we use today. And it's mentioned that they are like a inch and a half wood frequently. I was reading the instructions. You do it yourselfers. You had fun reading the directions on how to do this and how to join and how to plane and what precautions to take. And here we are. There's 3 hives on this hive carrier like this. And this one is a metal hook so that you can hook and handle so that you can carry. Here's a yoke to be able to lift these. Rope carrier. There was a lot of carrying. I'm glad to see that they were often using 2 people. Here's that one. It reminds me of a sedan chair. It's on its own little legs and you can pick it up. Oh my goodness, they put 5 on there. Okay, I think that's asking for trouble. But 2 people can carry more with these. In the bee cellar, they did things that were interesting. Here's like they still did the tilting of the hives. Tilting from so that any moisture, any condensation that did form could go from the back of the hive to the front wall, trickle down, roll out, or along the hive, the bottom, solid bottom board, trickle out. I thought this was fascinating. They did so many things. Here's more cellars again, built into the side hill. They're talking like it'll hold 200 colonies. They weren't making small ones necessarily. Some people did. They had interesting ways they would heat. They would they would build a fire in the stove, which I think is, where is the stove located? Because these door opens here, underground pipes, if they would actually, I'd have to look at this some more. I'm not sure it shows the stove in here. There are other designs where it shows the stove. One thing they did was they knew that you didn't blow cold air directly. And again, whatever you're doing in ventilation with your bees, I hope you're going for circulation, but not a draft directly on your cluster of bees. Whatever you decide. And this is diagrams to say, okay, can we do this? How about we do 1-inch openings up here? And then how much we need to be able to walk in here. Yeah. More bee houses, a lot of concrete. And some people said, well, but that doesn't help you because concrete can wick away, can conduct moisture out. Other people say, no, actually, concrete caves and such are actually thermal stable. They're not cold, but they're not hot. They can hold things, stabilize. They stabilize temperatures, which for bees, if you're going to try to overwinter them inside and you're keeping it dark and you don't want them to wake up in terms of coming out of cluster, that's important. One thing that I didn't mention was all that carrying bees. If you did hit a really warm spell, people would pick up all of the bees out and take them outside to give them a cleansing flight on a really sunny day, and then move them all back in at night. And even Ian Stepler up in, it's Miami is actually the name. I think it's Miami, Manitoba or something, where he is up there in Canada. And even he, on a really good weather day, may take bees out of his climate controlled red light warehouse and on a good weather day, give them a sun flying break. It's something that even now they do in warehousing. So that's really the part that I was so excited about. There was they were other things that were interesting too. Let me stop this though. And okay, I thank you so much for listening to all that. I can actually stop the recording when I remember how.